In our last episode on principles for interpreting Ellen G. White, I presented 4 principles, and now I will provide just a brief summary, and then I will add a few more in this new episode. The first great principle is to recognize the primacy of the Bible and the subordination of the writings of Ellen G. White. This is perhaps the most important principle, since Adventists, we ascribe to the sola scriptura principle, which means that the Bible and the Bible alone is the only source of our doctrines and beliefs. This principle mandates that all our beliefs should be established directly from the Bible, and her writings are only there to clarify, apply, or impress those truths rather than to introduce new doctrinal concepts or introduce radical new things apart and different from the Bible. So this has strong implications for the way we approach her writings, and it is perhaps the principle that will modify the most the way we read her writings. Ellen G. White said the following words when she was being involved in a controversy surrounding a topic of the daily, which is a concept from the book of Daniel, chapter 8. And she didn't want to see herself quoted as the sole authority. And so she wrote a letter to a few people, but in general to Adventists back in the day, that were using her in this regard as the sole authority, sometimes even equal to the Bible. Notice what she says. I have words to speak for my brethren east, west, north, and south. I have requested that my writings shall not be used as the leading argument to settle questions over which there is now so much controversy. I entreat of elders, and she names a few of them, and others of a few leading brethren, that they make no reference to my writings to sustain their views of the daily. Notice that in this particular topic, she resists that her writings are being used, or people are asking her to just come and clarify the daily. And she doesn't want to see and to be used in that way and to settle that controversy. And this is, you can read this in Selected Messages, page 164. So it is absolutely clear that for Ellen G. White, this principle was the key for understanding her role in the church. And the second principle has to do with the understanding of her self-perception and mission. How did Ellen G. White saw herself and her role in the Adventist movement, in the early Adventist movement? Sister White did not perceive herself as a systematic theologian, or as a comprehensive historian, or a scientific expert. Instead, she articulated herself as a messenger of the Lord, with a pragmatic, evangelistic, and pastoral vocation that she did all throughout her ministry. Her primary aim was to communicate spiritual truths, offer guidance for practical Christian living, rebuke sin, and promote obedience to biblical principles. So her main purpose in writing was not to present historical facts, right? Either biblical or otherwise. Her main purpose was always evangelistic. She was always a soul winner, heavily involved with the mission and evangelistic efforts in the church. She was always a homiletician. In other words, somebody who used the scripture to preach, to appeal to people who were listening and eager to hear the gospel. She was always a pastor. She was always trying to bring people to the foot of the cross, right? All of her preachings, and most of her books, for that matter, Instead of being very organized and heavily systematic theologically books, they were designed to bring people closer to the cross and close to the gospel and to the Adventist message for that matter. And this brings us to the third principle. The third principle that we should implement in order to avoid confusions with Ellen G. White writings is that we should understand the nature of inspiration. The Adventist Church traditionally has ascribed, and Ellen G. White herself ascribed, to the idea of thought inspiration and not verbal inspiration or word for word inspiration. The Adventist understanding of Ellen G. White's inspiration is predominantly a thought or dynamic view as opposed to a verbal or word for word dictation of her message. This means that God impressed ideas, concepts, and thoughts upon her mind, and also allow her to articulate those divine expressions and messages in her own language, using her own style, her personal expressions, and she sometimes draw from existing vocabulary and literary conventions of her time. Ellen G. White was a person of her time, which is one of our next principles. This understanding explains why her original manuscripts sometimes, right, they contain scratchings, rewritings, spelling, and grammatical errors. If we believe that Ellen G. White was verbally inspired, in other words, word by word, then it would be difficult to then go and read her manuscripts, the one that she wrote with her own hand, which we have many of them, and to notice that there were many mistakes in there, scratchings and misspellings, and sometimes to notice that she had some inaccurate information sometimes, right? And so it is then important to distinguish the two ways in which sometimes inspiration is taken, which is, in one way, we have verbal inspiration, which has to do with a word-by-word inspiration of the Bible, and so in this case of the writings of Ellen G. White. And on the other side, a thought or dynamic inspiration, which is where God works in the mind of the biblical writers, and in this case of Ellen G. White, but the writers are free to use their own expressions, their own circumstances, and to use different ways in which they will communicate the divine message. In other words, there is a big role of the human agent in this regard, but also a big role of the divine, which is the one that gives the message at the end of the day. And of course, the divine message, it's the most important part. However, the author is free to express those messages in various different ways, in various different forms and styles, right? And we can see that in the Bible. And so she herself differentiated between inspiration of the individual and literal inspiration of every word. In fact, she spoke clearly that she did not believe in verbal or word-for-word inspiration. She said that inspiration, the Holy Spirit worked in the mind, and not as, and the Holy Spirit did not use biblical writers as the pen, but rather it was a combination of both the divine message plus the way in which humans communicate that message. The last principle to remember from last time is that we need to understand, just as we would for studying the Bible, right? That we need contextual interpretation. And this is key element, not only for studying the Bible, but also for studying Ellen G. White. Now, this is a very hard task, especially when it comes to the Bible, right? Because contextualizing the Bible and understanding the historical context sometimes can be very difficult. But of course, we have not only the Bible that gives plenty of historical context, but also extra biblical material, archaeological discoveries, other writings of the time that sometimes help people to understand the context in which a particular biblical passage is being written or expressed. And so with Ellen G. White, but the difference though is that with Ellen G. White we have more access to the context in which she was writing. We have plenty of documents and information and history of the time. We have her personal letters that they speak about the personal circumstances in which she was writing. So we do have enough information about the contextual interpretation principle, right? Which means that time, place, and circumstances are important. Accurate interpretation demands careful consideration of the specific context in which Ellen G. White's statements were made. These include the historical period, right? Geographical location, cultural norms, the specific problems being addressed, and even her personal circumstances or even emotional state, which we know, for that matter. We know what she was going through when she lost her husband and the years that followed that. Or we can at least understand a few things about that. Once, talking about in the way in which people should use her testimonies, she said a very interesting and strong statement that I will read it here. She says, and this is in the context of people using her writings and what she said for the health reform. Notice what she says. We see those who will select from testimonies the strongest expressions, and without bringing or making any account of the circumstances under which the cautions and warnings are given, make them of force in every case. Thus, they produce unhealthy impressions upon the minds of the people. There are always those who are ready to grasp anything of a character which they can use to rein in upon people to a close, to bring severe test, and who will work elements of their own characters into their reform that they are trying to bring. In this case, the health reform. These, at the very outset, raises the combativeness of everyone they might help if they dealt carefully, bearing a helpful influence which would carry the people with them. So she warned about people using her testimonies in a way that will harm people. But sometimes she warned also, of course, here in this text, and this is from Testimonies on Health Reform. This is in 1881. And this is published in Selected Messages, Volume 3, page 203 to 288. And I will post it here so that you can read it for yourselves. Arthur White, Ellen G. White's grandson, pointed an important issue when he wrote the following. Notice what Arthur White says. Many have erred in interpreting the meaning of the testimonies by taking isolated statements or statements out of their context as a basis for belief. Some do this even though there are other passages. Notice this is very interesting. Some do this even though there are other passages which, if carefully considered, would show the positions taken on the basis of the insulated statement to be untenable. So notice this, what Arthur White is saying, and this is in the book that he wrote about Ellen G. White, and this is from 1969. Notice that he is saying that about her grandmother, right? And the way people use the writing is that people will try to back up their arguments with Ellen G. White and sometimes isolate her writings and force the writings of Ellen G. White to say things that she probably didn't say according to historical context, but that people will use those writings. But if they will compare that with something else she said elsewhere, those arguments will be untenable, will be difficult to sustain. So in other words, he implores readers to use the context. And so notice what it continues saying. It is not difficult to find individuals sorry, let me read this again. It is not difficult to find individual sentences or paragraphs in either the Bible or Ellen G. White writings which may be used to support one's own ideas rather than to set forth the thought of the author. Right? And so this is when we force our own ideas into the test, which is very common, right? Not only of preachers, but Bible interpreters and people who read the Bible, which is that we force our own context and ideas into the biblical test. And in this case, he says the same of Ellen G. White. People are forcing their own perceptions of the world and ideas on her writings. And he's very much opposed to that. Now that we had this refreshment, we can move to the rest of the principles that we said last time. And these ones are are related to some of the ones that we have spoken before, but they are key to the understanding of Ellen G. White as well. So the first principle is one that may come as a surprise for most Adventists, but one that could save people, and I think this deeply, one that could save people who do not know too much about Ellen G. White or have not done an in-depth study of her ministry and writings. This is that we should, and this is the principle, this is that we should acknowledge her humanity. Very interesting though, right? And why? It is because unlike many authors from the distant past, especially biblical figures, whose personal lives remain largely unknown beyond what is recorded in Scripture, we possess a wealth of information about Ellen G. White as a person. And this is very important. And this is due not only to her extensive publishing writings, but also to her private correspondence, including letters sent to various individuals. In addition, we have numerous testimonies from those who knew her personally, her family members, including children and grandchildren, which continue to share insights from their interactions with her, and with church leaders who have documented their impressions and experiences with Ellen G. White. Remember, Ellen G. White lived and experienced and had different circumstances with various church leaders, and we have information from those church leaders who lived during her time. So in short, right, we know far more about Ellen G. White's life and literary methods than we do about most historical figures or religious figures for this matter. Therefore, it is far better to share accurate, well-researched information about her than to leave people to discover biased websites, and I am going to say this very bluntly. Therefore, it is far better to share accurate, well-researched information about her than to leave people to discover biased websites, books, or YouTube videos that either excessively glorify her or unfairly criticize her. And we have plenty of those on both sides. So for example, there is a very interesting video on YouTube page. So for example, there is a very interesting video on the YouTube page of the Adventist Digital Library called Jest. Yes, I remember Ellen G. White. And this is a video of people who knew Ellen G. White personally, especially some of her family members. that during the time that this video was recorded were asked about to give their own experiences for Angie White. So in terms of recognizing her humanity, we can say that there is an overall consensus that Sister White had extraordinary spiritual and leadership gifts, but as it is with all human beings, right, she was also a complex and imperfect human. So present-day readers who are troubled by harsh and inspiring language need to understand a culture that emphasizes plain speaking. And this is very important, right? Because Ellen G. White is coming to us from a time, from a northeastern United States area that was known for plain speaking. People were tough to one another sometimes, and that was just very common. And so this is not a surprise then that readers today sometimes might feel a little uncomfortable with the way in which she wrote to somebody or the way she expressed some idea, right? And so Ellen G. White's style and temperament can be off-putting if we demand the warm, sort of therapeutic approach praised in modern America today, right? A context in which today we emphasize on being polite and politically correct, right? But that was not the case back in those days. But that would be as unrealistic, right, as expecting, for example, Isaiah to write English. The prophet Isaiah to write English. He didn't write English, he wrote Hebrew, and ancient Hebrew for this matter. Her conviction that God had gifted her with a special charisma and called her to a distinctive ministry did not change her as a person, born and raised in the 19th century New England. Gilbert Valentine, a well-known Adventist historian, in the book The Prophets and the Presidents, which is a book that speaks about the relationship of Ellen G. White with different presidents of the General Conference throughout her time, highlighted many episodes when Sister White gave a strong and forceful reproof to different presidents of the General Conference and other leaders, among those including her husband, James White, who was the second president of the General Conference. And this is the way Gilbert Valentine puts this. Notice, James White, the leader of the entire Seventh-day Adventist denomination, was having trouble accepting the pointed advice and criticism of his wife, who was in turn suspecting that her husband was not accepting the validity of her God-given call to write instead of traveling to camp meeting with him. While entrusted with the supervision of the whole work, James White wrote to Ellen. Notice what James White wrote to Ellen. I think it wrong to be second to the private opinions of Ellen G. And I would read this away. Again, it's posted here so you can read it better than me. I think it wrong to be second to the private opinions of anyone. This was a marital moment within two very strong-minded New Englanders. James was not only the husband of this household, right? He was the president of the church. And in human terms, he was Ellen G. White's boss, if we go in that way, right? James White went on, as Ellen G. White quoted him to Lucinda, a friend that apparently they had in common. Notice what he says. While on the stage of action, I shall use the good old head God gave me until he reveals that I am wrong. You, and notice this is what he says of Ellen G. White, your head won't fit my shoulders. Keep it where it belongs, and I will try to honor God in using my own, declare this proud husband and church president. Notice what he says. I shall be glad to hear from you, but don't waste your precious time and strength lecturing me on matters of mere opinions. Now, you can see the inside of the relationship sometimes that Ellen G. White had with her own husband, who was the leader of who was a leader of the Adventist Church. This is a very interesting relationship, right? Because on the one side we have a prophet, right, a prophet with spiritual gifts who is writing also to criticize her own husband, but on the other side we have her husband defending his position and saying, I have my own ideas, and I don't waste your time in lecturing me about things that are only of mere opinions, because probably I have mine. So you notice this is a very challenging and interesting situation here. So this is what we know, and this is why I say that we know far more of Ellen G. White the person and Ellen G. White's relationship with others than, far more than any other biblical writer, because we just have the sources to quote them. So the other part is, and this sometimes comes as a surprise, and this is the last principle that I will state today, and is probably the one that I will spend a little bit more time, because this is the one that probably is misused in many YouTube sources. And this is the principle about acknowledging the literary method of Ellen G. White. It is important to recognize the extensive use of sources that Sister White made in many of her books, and the role of the literary assistants, especially Miriam Davis, in producing some of her books. This is important for us publicly teach and talk, because so many have found this by accident on internet, right, and on other sources, and are shocked unnecessarily, since we have lost momentum to speak openly about these things. And as I said before, there are plenty of sources that will portray Sister White as a mere fraud as well, and the internet is full of this. There are other sources that will portray her even in divine overtones, right? But also some others will portray her as a mere fraud. And this is what we cannot allow, and I think the only way to prevent that is from teaching people and showing people the data. How do we know what we know about Ellen G. White? We know that Ellen G. White was neither unique nor infallible. She was not unmarked by her historical context. She was not the final authority for all biblical interpretation, and she refused to be so in many cases. She was not always original, but often borrowed words and ideas from other writers, which were thoughtful men and women who did not themselves claim divine inspiration. These writers had mistakes that sometimes Ellen G. White brought into her own writings by quoting them. She took for granted many, but not all, of the same ideas that the Methodists and Baptists of her time accepted, from amusements to the age of the earth, right? In the case of amusements, people had an idea, religious peoples of the time, and Baptists and Methodists had an idea about amusements that Ellen G. White shared, and that's why she was part of the temperance movement in many cases. And so, and this is what, when we speak about the context, right? This is important when it comes to the principle of the historical context. William White, her son, A.G. Daniels, and others were quite familiar with the way that she used other sources. In 1928, William White pointed out to Leroy Fromm the following. Notice this is William White, Ellen G. White's son. Notice. She admired the language in which other writers had presented to their readers the scenes which God had presented to her in vision. And she found it both a pleasure and a convenience and an economy of time to use their language fully or in part, in presenting those things which she knew through revelation and which she wished to pass on to her readers. And this is the case, for example, of the Great Controversy. So let's continue that. It was actually quite significant, right? It opened the door for a turning point in the church understanding of Ellen G. White's interpretation. The great events which have marked the progress of reform in past ages are matters of history, well known and universally acknowledged by the Protestant world. They are facts which none can gainsay. This history I have presented briefly, and this is Ellen G. White talking about, in accordance with the scope of the book and the brevity which must necessarily be observed, the facts having been condensed into as little space as seemed consistent with a proper understanding of their implication. And this is the introduction of the book, right? This is the sort of the preface of it. In some cases where historian has so grouped together events as to afford, in brief, a comprehensive view of the subject, or has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted. But in some instances, not a specific credit has been given, since the quotations are not given for the purpose of citing that writer as an authority, but because his statement affords a ready and forceful presentation of the subject. She acknowledges her heavy reliance on non-inspired sources, which meant that she sometimes picked up their errors, leading to the need for correction later. She implicitly acknowledged that her historical writings were not error-free when she approved word changes in the 1911 edition of the Great Controversy. By the way, for those who do not know this story of the Great Controversy, and this is something Ellen G. White does, she sent this book for when she was thinking about another edition of the Great Controversy. She thought that it was a good idea to submit this book for some kind of review by some Adventist experts of the time. So she sent this book for review. And the person that reviewed the book sent it back to her with some corrections that she included in the Great Controversy. Even this person was hesitant to include those corrections because he thought, well, how am I going to correct the prophet? But Ellen G. White saw no problem in including some of those corrections in the Great Controversy. And that's why when you read the 1911 Great Controversy compared to the 1988 Great Controversy, you will find differences in which, and one of the bigger differences is though that the 1911 Great Controversy opted for including quotations of historians that before were not quoted. And so she recognized that. So it is funny to find that even today, a big number of Adventists, when reading the Great Controversy, sustain that the historical part of the book is free of errors, when it is in fact known, we know that today. Some of those details, especially, I'm not only talking about the historical part, which extends from an Ellen G. White overview of the entire Christian history. Some of those things have some historical mistakes. One more recognition that is healthy for us to make when speaking about her books, she relied on an increasingly extensive literary staff to accomplish this for her. So let's have a few examples to illustrate this. Let's talk about the Great Controversy. So for example, specific historical sources she relied upon include J.H. Merrill in his History of Reformation, James Wiley in the History of the Valdenses. Her chapter on the French Revolution, she used Sir Walter Scott, who was a fictional writer. In Patriarchal Prophets, in one of her other series of the Great Controversy, the book's narrative concerning the entrance of sin into the universe drew heavily on concepts and content from extra-biblically scenes detailed in John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost. So she used some of the wordings and some of the ideas. The Side of the Ages, for example, his book, this book, which of course is on the life of Christ, was found by the Life of Christ Research Project, a research conducted by the General Conference led by Bellman, that she used 31.4% of other literary sources. I mean, she copied ideas from other books. It contained some of her most famous and frequently quoted passages, which were copied from others sometimes. And for example, a powerful Trinitarian phrase was adapted from the book of the Gospel of John, written by the Scottish clergyman John Cumming. The book sketches from the life of Paul. Close readers have said that she drew heavily upon and borrowed from Y.J. Conybeare and J.S. Housen's Life and Epistles of Saint Paul. And the book Steps to Christ, and this is an interesting one because this is a very nice, powerful devotional book. But this book was, she relied upon Miriam Davis to sort of put together this book using many of her writings from, I don't know, from articles and from other sources, and Miriam Davis sort of did put the puzzle together. So sometimes even Dennis 14 will advise that you should put author Ellen G. White and co-author Miriam Davis, right? Because she did a lot of putting together. Although almost all of the ideas were from Ellen G. White, but there was a lot of work into sort of getting all of those ideas from different writings that she wrote before and then putting them together in the book Steps to Christ. So Miriam Davis had to do a lot with that. And so that's the reality of Ellen G. White, right? Of her writings. This is just that we know a lot how those things were composed. Because Miriam Davis acknowledged many of those. So notice, though, that this is a way in which we can understand the world of Ellen G. White and the world of her writings. And if we do not teach this, right, to people, then they will find it sometimes from a very bad YouTube video that is very biased against or too much defending Ellen G. White, on apologetics of Ellen G. White. So I think when it comes to Ellen G. White, is we should be honest in teaching people. If we do have, with many of the people who get baptized, they don't understand too much how is it that we have a prophet. So for them it's just a little complicated. And they go on probably listening to people quoting Ellen G. White, and sometimes they become even good readers of Ellen G. White, but then suddenly one day they realize, because of a YouTube video or a website, many of these things and many wrong things even that people say about Ellen G. White, and they find this very shocking and surprising. So I think this is also our mistake, right? Again, Ellen G. White was, yes, a person with a charisma, a spiritual gift, right? That the Bible speaks about those spiritual gifts, which is the gift of prophecy and the gift of pastoring and the gift of, many of those things. Even a big leader. Ellen G. White was a good leader. But that doesn't mean that she was not a human. And it doesn't mean that in writing all that she wrote, she didn't use ideas of other authors. She did use. And that doesn't take away the originality, right? Nor it doesn't take away the fact that she was and is recognized by Adventists and inspired prophet. And so that is the picture that I wanted to picture about Ellen G. White. So acknowledge, right, the literary method of Ellen G. White, but at the same time celebrating who Ellen G. White was and still is for us. The counsels, the writings, the wealth that we have, the spiritual well that we can draw from these writings are difficult to express. But on the other side, right, to understand how did that happen. And to be honest, and this is something that I will just say here in the last part, to be honest, we just don't know about the biblical writers. How did they use all song? It doesn't mean that they, right, did or use the same way that Ellen G. White wrote, because there was not, books or libraries like we have today, or she had in the time. But they also used expressions and ideas and quoted one another, right? And so that's something that we know from the Bible. So this is it for today. Thank you for listening and watching this podcast, the Adventist Clarity Project, which is a podcast that seeks to bring clarity toward Adventist mission and history. Thank you so much. See you next time.